So thank you for that kind introduction, and it actually reminds me of a joke that I hope I don't get wrong because I wasn't prepared to say it, but it is in the book, but it's about the Lone Ranger and Tonto, and they're riding around in the West, and they get into a horrific fight with the Indians, and in fact it's Geronimo himself who is leading the battalion of Native Americans against the Lone Ranger, and the Lone Ranger actually gets the worst end of the deal. And Geronimo is standing above him and about to deliver the fatal coup de grace. He looks down and he says, "El naciste?" Which brings me to the first point is that you may recognize one or perhaps even both of these figures. On the left is Christopher Columbus, and on the right is a basketball player, Giannis Antetokounmpo. And you might ask, what do they have in common? And the answer, of course, as we all know, is that they're both Greek Americans. Now that needs a little bit of an explanation. The idea that Columbus is Greek is admittedly not represented by any non-Greek historian. But Seraphine Panutis wrote a long, and I have to say, having read it, a quite convincing book to argue about his Byzantine roots. He was not a merchant son from Genoa. That we sort of know. Everyone sort of claims them, but it is odd that there are many Columbuses on the island of Chios, which is not a very Greek name. He certainly spent some time there. Whether he identified as Greek, we don't know. Giannis Antetokounmpo is a more recent story. He's known as the Greek Freak. And he is a good Greek boy from the neighborhood of Sapolia. And he grew up in Athens as a refugee, as a migrant. He did not have a Greek passport until he actually signed a professional basketball contract in America when he was suddenly reclaimed by the Greeks as Greek. And speaks Greek fluently, far better than me because he grew up here. And among many amusing facts about him, and he's been embraced by the Greek American community certainly, he seems like a very kalopedi. He said he missed his brother and his family a lot when he was in America, but they've all come to America. But what I find incredibly amusing is that the name on his uniform barely fits because it is the direct transliteration of the Greek transliteration of what otherwise would be a very phonetic name, which is Antetokounmpo, which could be spelled alternatively in English, but it still has the Greek spelling of his last name in Latin letters. The first Greek that we know for sure came to what is now America was in 1528, a man by the name of Don Teodoro. And he arrived with Navarrose's fleet off what is now Pensacola, Florida, and they were trying to secure fresh water. The Native Americans insisted that they have a hostage while water was being procured, and Don Teodoro volunteered himself as a hostage and went ashore and was never seen again. Presumably he was killed by the Native Americans. So the first to set foot on America was not a great success. There was also an ill-fated Nea Smyrna colony in 1763 when Florida passed from Spanish to British hands. And it consisted of about 1,400 people, 400 to 500 of whom were from the Mani. 14 years later, however, in 1777, after starvation and deprivation and revolt, the colony failed, and about 100 Greeks moved to St. Augustine, Florida, where they did quite well. The oldest standing school building in the United States was built by John Yiannopoulos, and but the Greeks, by and large, assimilated into Spanish and American culture at the time, and no real trace of the community in any Greek sense exists, except for the school building. The first Greek Orthodox Church was established in 1864 in New Orleans, which is otherwise not known as a prominent Greek American city, except it is famous for their annual Greek church picnic, which my wife and I went to, and were amazed that it draws tens of thousands of people because they take their Glendy seriously in New Orleans. But the real Greek immigration to America, the mass migration, started with a man named Christos Tsakonas. He was born in 1848 in a village near Sparti, and he was a very typical immigrant in many ways. He completed a few years of school in the village. He wanted to better himself financially. He first went to Piraeus and then to Alexandria. Did not succeed as much as he wanted and left for America in 1873. This was an unprecedented step for a man of peasant background, and he became known as the Columbus of Sparta. And the fact that he is from the Peloponnese is particularly noteworthy because it was and remains the primary region of origin for Greek Americans. Today in the Peloponnese, about 1 million people live there in modern Greece, which is about 10% of the Greek population, but about half of Greeks who ever came to America come from the Peloponnese. What you see on the slide is the general sort of stages of Greek migration chronologically. And the largest groups, as you can see, is in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, 1900 to 1920. That is what made Greek America as we know it today. Before that, in the 1880s, about 2,000 Greeks came to America, mostly from Sparti. By the 1890s, 15,000 Greeks were coming over and from a much wider area in the United States. The 1890 migration was precipitated by a collapse in the European market for raisins and other dried fruits, which was Greece's principal export from that region at the time, and the resulting impoverishment of the countryside. But the flood of Greeks into America again happened in the early 20th century. In those first 2 decades of the 20th century, close to 1 in 4 Greek males between the ages of 15 and 45 departed for America. The exodus was massive and contributed to the culture of both countries through that flight from Greece. The irony, of course, is that the Greeks heard that the American streets were paved with gold. And so they came to America and found that not only were the streets not paved with gold, they weren't even paved at all. And not only that, they found that the Greeks were the ones that were supposed to pave them. This migration continued until 1924, when the doors of emigration to America closed. The Greeks of this early 20th century migration, they roughly can be divided into 3 groups. The first, I'll get back to the picture in a second. The first went to the mill towns of New England, Lowell, Massachusetts in particular. The first Greek that went to Lowell was Dimitri Kasamatis in 1874. And by 1890, the Greek population had doubled to 2. But by 1895, 200 Greeks were in Lowell, and after 1900, many women started coming from Greece, many of them picture brides, never having met the men that they were destined to marry. But when women started coming after 1900, that is when we can really say there was a start of a Greek American community, as opposed to simply a Greek diaspora coming to America to return. The first Byzantine style Greek church was in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1906, and by 1927 there were 15,000 Greeks in Lowell, which made it the 3rd largest Greek American city after Chicago and New York. And to this day, Massachusetts still is an extremely high concentration of Greeks and punches above its weight culturally in Greek American community, primarily through, right now through politicians. Paul Tsongas, Michael Dukakis, and others all come from Massachusetts. The second significant group went to the big cities, primarily Chicago and New York, but also all big cities in the East and Midwest in America developed a Greek community and saw the formations of what we would recognize today as Greek towns in these communities with stores and churches centered around the Greek community. Chicago never had quite as many Greeks as many believe, though the Greek population figures are often exaggerated. There were probably 50,000 Greeks in Chicago and New York in the 1920s. Chicago would claim that it was the third largest Greek city in the world, which is a bit of wishful thinking when you consider even at the time Alexandria and Smyrna and other places. But it was a bold thinking that was reflective of the Greek community. The community itself settled in the near west side, what is today the University of Illinois at Chicago, and very few, the Greek population is gone through urban renewal and flight to the suburbs, but the Greek town still exists through restaurants and a few stores on Halsted Street in Chicago. But the Greek community also centered around the Hull House, which had played a prominent role in American history it was an organization dedicated to helping immigrants adapt to life in America. And the people there particularly commented on the amazing feat of seeing Greeks perform Greek plays in Greek to a Greek crowd, and brought back all the Hellenism of the era, which of course was probably greater in the eyes of Xeni looking at the Greeks than of the Greeks themselves. But the Hull House played a major role in the social lefty side of the American immigrant experience. In 1905, there was a Greek restaurant in Chicago, and the typical Greek business as this town would have looked something like this. This is actually my great-grandfather's store on the west side of Chicago. That's him up there. He died before I was born. That's a relative who was his son who was killed in World War II. But this is the typical sort of the second stage after being a peddler on the street or in the market that you would see in Greek American communities. This was a Greek American social function, also from family pictures, because my grandfather is featured in the center of it with a woman who I cannot help but notice does not look Greek. And to make it even more interesting, is the woman he married is sitting behind the woman he brought there as his date. So perhaps this is the very function they met at, which was a Northern Epireutic meeting in Chicago. But you can, sitting behind my grandfather is his future father-in-law, and to our right and his left would be my Yaya, who unfortunately died when my father was rather young. In places like Chicago and New York, Greeks often settled in neighborhoods where Italians had just recently preceded them, and took up traditional occupations such as fruit peddler and bootblack, which was what my grandfather did, and then he later opened a shoe store. And of course, the Greek restaurant that perhaps Greeks are most known for by non-Greeks in America. There was an interesting anecdote that in 1905, a Greek restaurant put up an electric sign. And the non-Greek restaurant owners went to the Greek newspaper and complained about it and said that he was a slave to the electric company. And if restaurateurs kept up that nonsense, they'd just be paying all their money in electricity and would go out of business. And the Greek American newspaper in Chicago wrote that the Greek, because of his innate progressiveness, noticed the advantage and practicability of the newly developed electric sign and accepted the innovation in spite of the additional expense for electricity. Indeed, it is a credit to him, and in years to come, those who now object to the electric sign will realize its importance and acknowledge the foresight of the Greek mind. The non-Greek restaurateurs will see the benefit of the electric line and fall in line to follow the progressive Greek. If they do not do it now, most assuredly they will do it later. Many, of course, I think the electric sign did become standard, but many of them did not adapt and change. And it's one of the ways in which Greeks took over the restaurant business, along with other businesses, other industries as well. But they innovated, and they simply did a better job. Presumably everyone in those times worked long and hard hours, so I don't want to necessarily put it to the Greek work ethic, but they simply had a competitive advantage in the fields that they went into. In the 1909 article in the American Journal of Sociology, said that during the short time he has been in Chicago, the Greek has established his reputation as a shrewd businessman. On Halsted Street, they are already saying it takes a Greek to beat a Jew. Um, Despite being a greater presence in Chicago, though roughly equal in numbers, certainly because Chicago is a smaller city compared to New York, New York became the center of many Greek American institutions then and remains so to this day. Greek American newspapers, largely, they're also in Chicago, but really proliferated in New York. The National Herald is the last remaining Greek paper, daily Greek paper published in Greek, and they have a weekly English edition as well. And of course, New York became the head of the Greek Orthodox Church in America. New York also had one counterpart that was somewhat unique to the Greek American experience, which was the fur industry. The Greeks employed by the furriers, especially between the two world wars, were one of the few Greek workers' groups in America to be attracted to communist labor organizations, as Greek Americans generally remain far more conservative than the rest of America, and to a large extent, Greeks here in Greece. Another Greek union that was dominated by Greek Americans, and I should point out in my rigorous research methods, I discovered this in a bar in Astoria, when I ran into a man who was a worker for the Bridge and Structural Steel Painters Local 808. For the first half of the 20th century, these dangerous and high-altitude jobs on bridges and skyscrapers were known for Mohawk Indians, for the Mohawk Indian workers who dominated the trade. Today they earn about $40 to $50 an hour, and one of the few remaining strong union occupations. And Latin American workers now predominate in the union. But from the 1960s to the 1990s, Greek Americans painted the bridges of New York City, and Greek was often the language that was spoken on the bridges. In tougher times, Greeks faced, of course, troubles at an individual level. Was often not documented are the number of Greeks that returned to Greece, arguably in failure. Often given short shrift are the Greeks who remained in America but simply did not succeed in a brutal capitalistic environment. There were also more organized anti-Greek attitudes. The largest of these was in 1909 in South Omaha, where there were about 3,000 Greek laborers, a number that was swollen by unemployed railroad workers working out in the winter, in a shanty town on the outskirts of town. There was, among the nativist population, there was already intense opposition to these, to what were seen as these lowlifes, carousing and gambling. And there were also opposition because many were presumably involved as strikebreakers. In 1909, on February 19th, an Irish immigrant, an Irish-born police officer, Ed Laurie, arrested a fellow immigrant, the Greek-born John Masoudides. The Irish police officer, Laurie, was a family man from a labor background. He joined the police force after he lost his job at the lard processing plant because he refused, in sympathy, to continue working as a manager and went out on strike with the striking workers. He wouldn't cross the picket line, he was fired, and he became a police officer. Masoudides was in many ways typical of the Greek immigrants. He left from a village near Kalamata in 1906 and came to America. The Greek was with 17-year-old Lillian Brees when Officer Laurie arrested Masoudides for public vagrancy. Now some, and of course we don't know, we weren't there, some claim the policeman was drunk and enraged at seeing the Greek publicly walking with a white prostitute. Other accounts say that Brees was an English teacher and Masoudides her student. I always like to point out that these two accounts are not mutually exclusive. They both very well might be true. But regardless of Brees's primary vocation, what is not in question is that on the way to the police station, Masoudides shot and killed Officer Laurie. This led to public condemnation in two local newspapers. And there was a resolution published 2 days later in the paper that urged for a mass meeting and to rid the city of the Greeks. After this meeting, over the course of a few hours, a mob rampaged through the Greek quarter and burnt most of it to the ground. 36 Greek businesses were destroyed, and all of the Greeks and many other immigrants who were mistaken for Greek were driven by the mob from the city. The US government actually paid reparations to the Ottoman Empire after this, among other countries. The press coverage of this riot triggered copycat anti-Greek demonstrations, which were occasionally violent, but none of them as violent or brutal. But in Kansas City, Kansas, and Dayton, Ohio, there was similar sentiment. The irony of this immigrant-on-immigrant xenophobia was not lost on everybody. The Shreveport Journal in Louisiana wrote that we note with interest that Mrs. O'Shaughnessy of Omaha objects to the Greeks taking America, as if the O'Shaughnessy's and the O'Tooles and other Irish have not already grabbed it. A year after the murder of the police officer, Massarides was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison. He was furloughed by the governor after 5.5 years and deported and immigrated. We don't know for sure, probably to Egypt, but despite my best efforts, I was unable to figure out what happened to him. The third sort of segment of the Greek-American experience went out west, primarily to the mill town, to the railroads and to the mines of the West. The Louis Tikas, perhaps, and there's a recent documentary that was made. I don't know if it's made it here yet, has it?
I saw it here.
It's worth seeing. I saw it recently in New York. The Greeks first went west in 1901, and they were bought by a Colorado company to work in steel mills. There were some Greeks out west already, but it was in those very first years of the 1900s that Greeks were imported out west en masse, primarily as strikebreakers. And it could be said that the difference between a scab and a union member was a few years of mine work. This was a pattern that was repeated constantly. In some locales, Greeks constituted the largest ethnic group among the workers. In 1910, close to 40,000 Greeks, which was about 40% of all Greek Americans at the time, would be found west of the Mississippi. And the primary man who was a notorious man in the padrone system, which is from the Italian word, where a man would promise you a job. In the best case scenario, it was bad. In the worst case scenario, it was a straight up scam. But in the best case scenario, you would go out west and receive a job, and the padrones would take money from your paycheck forever, along with, you would get your ticket out there, but you were basically enslaved to this man. The most prominent Greek American padrona was Leonidas Skyliades, the Tsar of the Greeks, and he came also from Sparta. He arrived in Salt Lake City in 1897, and really his position there was nothing, which resembled most that of an Ottoman despot in the way he ruled the Greek community. In 1912, copper miners in Utah went on strike, and the main issue for the striking workers was to get rid of Skyliades. They actually succeeded in that, but not before blood was shed, and to that we can credit the Cretans, who introduced a new labor tactic, which was taking up sniper positions and shooting people. Skyliades brought mainland Greeks to take over from the Cretans, and this use of Greek against Greek in the labor battles out west would poison intra-Greek relations for generations to come. And they're also reflected in Venizelos' royalist splits, and also between the Greek church centered in Greece and the Patriarch in Constantinople. Louis Tikas was born in Crete around 1884, and he was once a strikebreaker, but by 1910 he had set up a little cafanillo in Denver and became a US citizen. By 1912 he was a labor organizer and a translator for the United Mine Workers of America, and in 1913 there was a strike against the Rockefeller-owned Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. 9,000 coal miners went on strike in southern Colorado in Ludlow, which is just north of Trinidad, near the New Mexico border. The company refused to negotiate. And the demands of the workers, and they were pretty consistent in a lot of these strikes, they wanted recognition of the union, they wanted to be paid for dead time, which was basically the time they weren't hauling out coal, so the time they were laying tracks into the mine and the time that they were supporting the mine with wooden structures to prevent cave-in. That was all done on the miners' free time. The miners were not paid for that. And they also wanted a 10% wage increase. The other demands I find even more interesting, which was the right to choose their own doctor, the right to live and shop where they wanted, the abolition of the armed guard system, which enforced these rules. In many ways, the life of the miner was not like slavery. They were slaves. They were forced into communities in which they could not leave, with armed guards posted, and they were paid in company scrip, and that was that. That was the end. The irony of all those latter demands is that those were already the law. Most of the demands were simply to get the Rockefeller-owned company to observe the laws that were already on the books. The miners relocated their company town to a tent colony on private land that the union had bought in anticipation of the strike. And of course they bought it in a strategic location where they could shoot any strikebreakers that would come into the mine. The strikers were about 1,200 people, and of course it was entire families because they had to move their homes from their company towns to this tent city. And Mother Jones visited, the famous labor activist and feminist. She came out and offered her support. In October of that year, the government set up armed encampments around. You can see the camp in the background, armed positions. What always struck my attention was there was a particular vehicle, an armored car, that they put a machine gun on, and they called it the Death Special. And they would occasionally go by and shoot into the tents. In response, the miners dug pits in the tents, which they could hide in when the shooting started, for safety. Winter passed. And then in April 1914, this is the day after Pascha, militiamen and many armed guards that were recruited from out east, the Pinkertons, all those sort of usual suspects, the Pinkertons and so on, they raided the colony, burnt it to the ground, and looted the camp in what was known as the Ludlow Massacre. 19 people died, and what caught the public's attention was a number of children and their mother died in one of those pits, died of asphyxiation in one of the pits that they dug to escape from the Death Special. By multiple witness accounts on all sides, of course there was a large government investigation. Louis Tikas was a peacemaker during this and trying to rescue people from the fires and make peace, but he was captured by militiamen and hit and probably killed by a strike from a lieutenant's rifle, and then he was shot in the back after that. After Tikas was killed, here's the camp after the Ludlow Massacre. After Tikas was killed, hundreds of workers left their jobs and walked across the mountains of Colorado and New Mexico to Trinidad, Colorado for a mass funeral. And that's